Hey, everybody. My name is Jan. I'm from Xverse. And also, as you probably already know, I am the Bitcoin DGen here. And I'm here with Tyler, the
What
wizard.
what's up, guys? Excited to be here. I'm really excited to spend a little bit of time today talking about Mempool and transaction fees. So, without further ado, I say we just hop into it, Jan.
Let's get it. Yeah, super excited. Obviously, as you know, this is technically Bitcoin, where we are trying to demystify some of these things that are happening on Bitcoin that you guys are interacting with on every single day basis, I would say. And so, yeah, today, lesson five, mempool and transaction fees. I know that a lot of people that I have personally talked to about this sometimes can get a little bit confused. Like, how do these things actually work? And how do we really know what are the fees and how they're constructed, right? And so that's something that we're gonna discuss today with Tyler. So yeah, let's get into it, Tyler. What is mempool actually? Like, what is this thing all about? Like that people can even see on the mempool.space. Like, what is this thing all about?
Essentially, what we're looking to cover today is what is the mempool? When you go to mempool.space and see all this stuff floating around, like what actually is that under the hood? We'll talk a bit about how blocks are constructed, and that will actually give us the information we need to talk about how fees are determined. And I think that's what all the ordinal degens should be excited about. Now you can learn why some of these transactions, the fees are absolutely through the roof, while others, it seems relatively cheap. So to kick it off, let's talk a little bit about what is the mempool. So the mempool is essentially it's the collection of unconfirmed transactions that have been broadcast to the Bitcoin network. And I think the important thing to note here, the kind of interesting thing, is that each node holds its own mempool. So each node, if you're running a Bitcoin node at home, has its own mempool locally. And there's no such thing as a global mempool. So you might be thinking, hey, well, what the hell is that thing when I go to mempool.space and I see the mempool, right? Well, what you're seeing is the collective mempools of the nodes that mempool.space is pulling from. But that doesn't mean that it's showing you every single unconfirmed transaction that has been broadcast to the Bitcoin network. So let's talk a little bit about just kind of what that looks like and how that networking happens.
Totally.
So,
Maybe, Tyler, before you move on,
yes.
so when you say that if I go to mempool.space and I
Mhm.
look at, okay, this is the block that was just confirmed, that was just mined, or I see the transactions kind of waiting to be confirmed. So when you say that I am not seeing everything that has been broadcasted, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so maybe if we talk through this example, I can explain what we really mean there. And mempool.space will eventually see everything. But because Bitcoin is this decentralized network, there's actually some degree of latency to it.
Mm-hmm.
There's no central authority. It's not like everyone submits their transaction to the Bank of Bitcoin, the central authority, and then the Bank of Bitcoin says, okay, great, I now have this. What's actually going on is it's just a bunch of nodes talking to each other. So let's maybe look at a quick example here. So let's say that my node has a couple transactions in it. It might have transaction one where I'm going to send zero point 0.5 Bitcoin from Tyler, and we're going to send it to Jan. So if you remember back from our earlier episodes around UTXOs, you can just think of this as, and essentially a transaction that's sitting in my node and that we want to broadcast out to the network. And so maybe my node has another transaction in the mempool too. Maybe there's another transaction, and this is just one I've received from somewhere else, right? So maybe my node received something that said Udi wants to send zero point 0.3 Bitcoin, to Eric. And so this is sitting here, and this will be transaction two. All right, so that's the state of my node's mempool. And let's say, Jan, your node's mempool it also knows about this Udi to Eric transaction. So it says, yeah, I've also heard about the fact that Udi's sending zero point 0.3 Bitcoin to Eric. Uh, but I haven't yet heard about, so this is what we call TX2. I haven't yet heard about the fact that Tyler is actually, sending you Bitcoin. That's very exciting, right? You're about to make half a Bitcoin. And so the way this works is my node will literally be broadcasting this out. So it's, like the Wi-Fi signal. It's, bat signal over to Jan's node because we're connected now. And what will actually happen is this transaction that you see here, it's going to get packaged up and sent over here. We've taken this transaction and now, over here, your node now knows that I'm sending zero point 0.5 over to you. And so this is how the Bitcoin network actually works. And this is how the mempool works. So everyone who's running a node has their own idea of the mempool, and they're connecting to other nodes and they're saying, hey, Jan, I see you. Here's my list of unconfirmed transactions. Have you heard about all of these? And your node may say, well, actually, no, I hadn't. Thanks for letting me know. I'm going to add this one to my mempool now too. And so this is actually how transactions propagate around the Bitcoin network.
This is cool, Tyler. Just a couple questions again from a degen side of things.
Yeah.
Ultimately, the Bitcoin network will know about every single transaction. That's just how it has to be. And so
exactly.
When you say that there is a latency and that these nodes kind of communicate with one another, do I understand it correctly that sometimes the latency is caused because maybe my internet connection is not as strong, or maybe I'm not connected to the internet at all, and like when I connect to the internet, then I know about this transaction, etc. And so because of these kinds of things, that's the reason why like there is a latency between these nodes and when they know about all of the transactions and specific transactions.
That's exactly right. So, you can think of it almost as a network graph. And so if the network graph, you're at the center of it and you're touching all of the other nodes and you say, hey, I'm broadcasting this transaction, and you're connected to every other node in the Bitcoin network, then they'll very quickly know that, hey, this transaction is one that I want to be added to everyone's mempool. Now, let's say you signed a transaction, you hit confirm, you hit broadcast, but then your internet died before the transaction actually got broadcast out. Well, now no one else knows about this. Your transaction never got sent to anyone else's node, who never then sent it to other nodes. And so now no one really knows that, hey, Tyler, you actually wanted to send Jan 0.5 BTC. That just kind of got stuck locally. But when your Wi-Fi comes back on and you connect back to the internet, this transaction will float back out. It will make it into the mempool. And as long as it's still valid, as long as I didn't go and try and spend that UTXO somewhere else in the meantime, it'll show up on mempool.space in another 10 or 20 seconds.
Exactly. Yeah, so that's perfect. I think just to summarize kind of what even the user experience really is today, right? When it comes to buying ordinals and even sending ordinals to one another, like usually the experience is that when you do such things, you are connected to the internet, you know what you're doing, you're prepared for the mint, you're prepared for the transfer. And that's why you can usually see those transactions on mempool.space right away as you click confirm. Right. But there can be these instances where maybe some people are like broadcasting transactions from their cold wallets, right, that are not connected or whatever. And that's why there's these delays and, whatever it is. But ultimately, the user experience is usually pretty good. You see the transaction whenever you hit confirm because you're connected and you know that you want to send the Bitcoin right now. And as long as it's a valid transaction, like it just gets propagated or broadcasted right away.
Exactly. Bitcoin's a very healthy network. It has lots of nodes online. there's pretty low latency between the time you broadcast a transaction from your node out to other nodes and the time it propagates around the network. For anyone who's super interested, we'll drop. I have a paper in the resources you can go read that was written about how long it takes transactions to propagate around the Bitcoin network.
Amazing. Cool. Yeah, let's move on then, Tyler. What's the next thing on our list?
All right. So now that we've talked about these unconfirmed transactions, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about how blocks are built. So if you've ever gone to mempool.space, you've probably seen your transaction sitting, hopefully it's in the next block, maybe it's 2 blocks back, but it's sitting somewhere in there, and you're being told, hey, we believe that the next time a miner finds a block, your transaction will likely be included, or it will be included 2 blocks from now, or whenever it will happen. So to understand that, I think we need to understand a bit about when miners discover a new block, what are they doing? And when you discover a new block, what you essentially won is you won your block reward. So right now that's 6.25 Bitcoin, soon to be cut in half. But the second thing you've won is the ability to fill up that block with these unconfirmed transactions in the mempool up to the size limit, and to collect the fees that have been paid on top of those transactions. Taking this analogy that a building a block is kind of like filling an airplane with baggage. The question is, well, how do we decide what baggage to bring onto the airplane? And so the first thing to do is to say, well, how much room does the airplane have in general? And we like to say that the airplane has roughly 4 what we'll call weight units, 4 megabytes of weight units, which are something we won't get into today. But let's say there's 4 megabytes of space on this airplane, right? What a miner is going to do is it's going to look at a transaction, an unconfirmed transaction, and it's going to say, I want to know 2 things. I want to know how big this transaction is, and then I want to know how much someone's willing to pay to put it on there. So let's say we have 3 transactions that are all the same size, but this one only wants to pay $1, and this one wants to pay $2, and this one wants to pay $3. Well, when you start filling up this block, when you start putting bags on the airplane, what you're going to do is you're going to take this $3 one and go put it in here first. You'll be like, well, this one clearly is willing to pay me more than the other 2, so this one's getting priority to come on the plane. Now it gets a little more complicated when someone shows up and they actually have an oversized bag. The bag looks this big, and this person also wants to pay $2 or even $3. Let's say they want to pay $3. Well, now you as the miner, you're like, well, let's say this block has a total size of 10, and this block has a total size of 5. All of these have a rough size of 5. Well, now I'm going to say, well, actually, the next thing I want to add into my airplane is this 5 size block that's willing to pay me 2, because the effective dollars per size is actually more than the effective dollars per size of this this 10 size block that's willing to pay me $3. I'd rather take the 5 size block that's willing to pay me $2. So I'm going to grab that one and I'm going to add that into my block here. So I'm going to put that one over. And now I'll go back and I'll say, okay, great. Well, now the thing I can make the next most money off is this 10 size block. So I'm gonna grab that and I'm gonna go, fill that up in here, and I'm gonna take the $3 I get from that. And so this is literally the process that miners are going through when they when they mine a block and they win the right to fill it up. They're saying, how much money per size, data size, am I getting? And I want to maximize that.
Makes sense. That's pretty clear. I think maybe one more thing to kind of mention here, Tyler, and that's again like related to the fact that this stuff happens actually automatically pretty quickly, and that's because the miners actually run software that like helps them do it, right? Because it's
Yeah.
not like one by one kind of selection. It's like you have a specific type of software that obviously optimize to make as much money as you can as a miner, and it just happens
Yep.
instantaneously, right?
Yep, exactly. So I guess the one kind of kicker here, and this, taking the analogy back to the airplane, is there's actually a limit to the size of the baggage that you can essentially bring to a block. And there are two
Yeah.
limits. The first limit is what's called the policy limit. So you, Jan, running your node won't let you broadcast something that's more than 400 kilobytes. So you won't be able to broadcast anything that takes up more than 1/10 of this entire block.
Yeah.
And so that's called the standard amount that you're allowed to have. So you can think of that like this is the limit to the oversized bag that you can bring on a plane. We'll take it up to 100 pounds, but if you bring me a 200-pound bag, I'm sorry, you're going to have to get a special plane to fly it for you. And then there's
Yeah.
the actual limit, which is the 4 megabytes. Obviously, that is the limit for any individual block. No one is able to put more than 4 megabytes of data on chain in a block ever, right? So we did that with the Taproot wizards. Udi's wizard, the original wizard, took up 4 megabytes. And in order to get that in, we actually had to take that transaction directly to miners because it would have been rejected. They would have said, well, your wizard, which takes up this entire space, the whole damn thing, right? This is not allowed by the standard policy in Bitcoin, but we, the miners, we can include it as long as it's a valid transaction. And so that's how the wizard ended up getting onto Bitcoin, and also why you don't see a ton of 4 megabyte blocks coming in. Not only would you have to pay the fees to make up for all the other things, but you have to actually go and talk to a miner and have them include it.
Totally. Yeah, this is a very great point. So, what you guys did with Taproot visits definitely historical for the history books. It's kind of like getting not even a private plane, but getting some sort of plane that can actually carry a special container. And
Yeah.
that's pretty hard to do in general if you want to ship whatever. So that's a really good analogy here. Awesome. I think we have a pretty good understanding, how, let's say, the blocks are built, constructed. Obviously, the miners want to make as much money as they can. And so it needs to make an economical sense. And we're probably going to do an episode on miners at some point as well, because there is a couple nuances or things that we should discuss in a little bit more detail. But I think for now, this is good enough. And let's get into some examples. What do you say, Tyler?
Yeah, so I think now comes the fun part that I think the degens have all been waiting for, which is how are these fees actually determined? How do we decide? Sorry, I'm gonna get my cursor out of there. So yeah, now comes the part that I think the degens are going to be really excited about, which is how are fees actually determined? So when you're going to transact, sometimes you're baffled as to why something is costing $30 in fees when it feels like a simple transaction. You thought you were just sending 0.1 Bitcoin to your friend, and yet all of a sudden you're getting fees cranked up on you. And this all comes back to what we just talked about, which is how miners think about what transactions to include. So the fee you pay for a transaction should be a function of the size of the data in the transaction and then the speed at which you want it confirmed. So I think the really important point to note here, and what we're going to talk about, is the amount of Bitcoin. It does not matter. So I'm going to start over here. Like the data size of your transaction does not change with the amount of Bitcoin you're sending. So if you could be sending 10 Bitcoin or 0.0001 Bitcoin, the data size of those two transactions could be identical. And I think that's the first important thing to note. So then we can actually talk about what does cause data size to go up and why do I find myself paying more for these transactions. So the first thing that will cause data size to go up are the inputs to your transaction. So as the number of inputs go up, the data size of your transaction is going to go up. And the reason that is because, and we'll look at an example later, if we have a transaction that let's say it has 5 UTXOs and you're sending them all to this one over here. Well, each one of these UTXOs requires a signature from your wallet. And that signature is actually large. It takes up a lot of data size. And so that's why the data size is going to go up with the number of inputs you have, because you're going to have to actually sign for every single one of those inputs to prove that you have it. Now, inputs are much more costly than outputs because they require this signature. And we talked in our first episode about UTXOs how outputs only have 2 fields. They have an amount field and the address they're going to. So outputs also cause your data size to go up, but your inputs are going to cause it to go up a lot more than the outputs. The last thing that can affect the data size is the address. And I encourage you all to read in the resources. We'll attach a really good article about SegWit and witness discounts and all of these fun things. I think it's a little too complex for today, but actually the address that you're sending to and from can affect the amount that you have to pay. So address can affect it, but it can either go up or down depending on what you're doing. So that's how we
Tyler,
get to this.
Maybe one thing. Sorry to jump in here, but I think, can you just comment on very briefly that the address itself? We do understand that there could be some difference, but is it like something major compared to the amount of data that you're actually including? I do feel like the inputs and outputs actually are the most important in terms of like defining the fee, and the address can have some impact, but probably not like significant, like 2x, 3x type of impact.
Yeah, you're exactly right, Jan. It's a much smaller impact, and I just wanted to include it for completeness. But I'll give it a tiny down arrow and a tiny up arrow. This can affect it, and I encourage people who are interested to learn more about it to go read about that. But by and large, what's going to have the biggest effect, the main factors, are going to be these inputs and outputs. So these are really the things that are going to drive the data size of your transaction and really drive what fee you're going to need to pay in order to get it included in a block.
Amazing. Perfect. Yeah. Just wanted to make that clear because I see people kind of asking about that. And obviously there is a difference, but it's not that major in a sense to maybe what people may think. So yeah, that's pretty cool. So now we kind of understand, like how you define or how the size is defined. It depends on the outputs, inputs, obviously that's where we start from. And that's pretty cool. So what do you want to do next? Do you want to actually pull up transactions, Tyler, and look into the mempool, see what actually happened, and how the difference can actually be pretty significant?
Yeah, so I'm excited. We're going to jump over to mempool.space. I'm going to run us through a couple transactions. We'll have this simple transaction that we talked about very early on where the block explorer is traveling around the blockchain. And then we'll look at a UTXO consolidation transaction. And I think you'll enjoy seeing how, these have very similar fee rates and yet vastly different fees. So to kick it off, this is our old trusty block explorer transaction. So if you recall, this is our block explorer going in this input number 1 on 10,000 sats. And it's basically just going from one address to another. So you'll see it's going from this 9x7g over to this 5LDF address. And all we're doing is we're paying the fees with this 50,000 sat UTXO. So you'll see it goes in with 50,000, it leaves with about 43,000, and those remaining 7,000 go off in fees. And in fact, you can see that right up here, right? It tells you what the fee was. Now, what's interesting to look at here is the fee rate here is about 32 sats per vbyte, and the fee is about $2. And if we go down here and scroll down, the thing I want to kind of highlight is that the size of this transaction is 354 bytes. So that's what the B is. Okay, so if you want to dig in more about virtual bytes and weights, again, doing some reading about SegWit is a great way to start there. But for now, let's just stick with this size in bytes, because what we're going to do is compare it to a UTXO consolidation transaction.
Perfect, Tyler. And before we jump into the next example, into the next transaction, just kind of want to remind everybody, and I think we actually discussed this before as we're talking more about, the Mempool block explorer, the block explorer before, is that this is a very simple transaction, right? This is like basically one of the simplest transactions that you can have. You're literally just sending, certain amount of sats, from one address to another. And that's why, the fee is actually pretty low.
Exactly. So this is a very simple transaction. I think the only way it could be simpler is if there was one input and that was spending to one output and just paying some fees off of that. But this is about as simple as you can get. Now, let's contrast that if we head over here and we check out this transaction, which is, see, it's happening at a similar fee rate, just in the mid 30s. And yet the fee that was paid was over $1,000. All right. So the one we just looked at with the Block Explorer paid $2, and this one is paying $1,000. And the reason is because I'm not going to blow this out because it'll take up my whole screen, but you see the number of inputs that are here, right? Input number 23, number 25. It goes all the way down, and in fact, it has about just over 1,200 inputs to this transaction. And each one of these inputs is a very small amount. And what the outputs are is the output is this one giant UTXO that's now 0.53 Bitcoin, and then the fee that they paid, which is the $1,000 fee that it cost to take all of these inputs, which were very small. They're probably worth, I don't know how much, maybe a couple dollars each, and put them all together into this one big output. And so we can actually see, I guess, if we go back down to the details, you'll see here that the size of this transaction is 128 kilobytes. Now compare that, when we looked earlier, it was a little over 300 bytes, and now we're at 128 kilobytes. So that's about a factor of 500 increase from where we were before. And that actually checks out on the math too, right? Before it was a $2 fee, and if you multiply that by 500, you get to $1,000 fee. And so I think this is a really good illustration of how the size of data, this data size, can have a very marked impact on the fee you have to pay in order to get it in. And that's exactly because it's basically blowing up the size of the baggage you need to bring onto the airplane. And so the miners are saying, well, you want to bring your giant bag, that's great, but you're going to have to pay for it. I think this was really exciting. In summary, I hope what we learned today was that the mempool is the set of unconfirmed transactions that a node is aware of, and that each node has its own mempool. That blocks are assembled from unconfirmed transactions, and blocks have a 4 megabyte size limit. And we use the analogy of loading luggage onto the airplane as to how we're going to think about, loading unconfirmed transactions into our block. And then finally, each unconfirmed transaction has a fee associated with it. And the fee needed for that unconfirmed transaction to actually become confirmed will depend on two factors. So the first is the amount of data in the transaction. And that amount of data, remember, is driven up by the number of inputs and outputs as the primary factors. It has nothing to do with the total amount of Bitcoin moving around. And then obviously you have to pay more if you want to go faster. So if you want your transaction to be included in the next block, you're going to need to pay a little more. And so that really gives us a holistic view of how the mempool works, how transactions are broadcast around the network, and then how you think about fees, both from a miner perspective and a user perspective.
Awesome, Tyler. Let's wrap it up. Let's end here, and we're gonna see you in the next episode.
See y'all soon.